Thank you very much, Kieran, and good morning, everybody. It's very interesting and a new environment for me to be in as Chief Commissioner, but by way of introduction, let me introduce you to the Commission. I want to focus this morning on planning in the inner city and how it might affect children, and then introduce you to not only the ethical or the ethical moral imperative for inner city development, but also the new legal imperative that's being introduced in our legislation. We were indeed appointed by President Higgins, and this is where I give you the public sector slightly defensive but diplomatic explanation of who we are as an organisation. We commenced on the 1st of November legally. There is now a new institution that's called the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission that's bringing together the Equality Authority and the Irish Human Rights Commission and combining them into a new institution that's there to kind of strengthen and promote human rights and equality in Ireland. The political imperative for the Commission began back in 1998, and the Good Friday Agreement is, I suppose, the foundation for the development of the Commission. And we are acting as a quasi-judicial institution, and we are aligned to the state. So we're part of the state's infrastructure. Kieran mentioned I was appointed along with the 14 members of the Commission by President Higgins. And the new legislation offers two changes to the level of our independence here in Ireland. The first is that we account for our statutory functions to the Oireachtas, directly to the Oireachtas, and the second is our financial expenditure and public accountability through our accounting officer. Sinead Gibney is here, who's our director, our new director, and Sinead accounts as the accounting officer for our financial expenditure directly to the Public Accounts Committee. So that's a polite way of saying we're not a quango, we're not an arm of government, we do not provide government services and we do not have any accountability to the government. Traditionally that was the Department of Justice, but it now shifts to our Parliament. But central to our mandate is the development of a culture of respect for human rights, equality and intercultural understanding. So where do we get the guidelines or the standards for equality and human rights? In terms of equality, that dates back to 1999, and the Equality Agency, our Employment and Equality Acts that traditionally looked at equality in the workplace, but have extended to include the provision of goods, services, accommodation and education. The third strand then is EU legislation, and then the one that's least well known is the human rights strand, so the international human rights standards that people yet have not come to terms with in Ireland. And that's really a significant part of our role as a Commission, is to try and make some connections for people between some what appear to be at the moment abstract concepts of international human rights law and making it real for people. And that's why this is an opportunity. The idea of development, the idea of planning in the inner city is a real opportunity to say to people this really affects people's everyday lives. So what we're trying to do is encourage people to develop that understanding and to see it as a means of raising public sector standards, not merely as a controversial mechanism of challenging government in the courts. So I would like to talk about children, largely because in the inner city, this is something that Kieran asked me specifically to focus on. But I'll just give you some sense or some flavour on why international mechanisms have concentrated on children. And the mechanism in terms of international human rights oversight is the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child, a group of 18 experts who globally get together, and each state on a 5-year cycle reports on the progress in relation to children's rights. So what they do is they produce what are called general comments, which is jurisprudence or philosophically looking at the developing ideas around a particular piece of law. In this case, it's about children's right to play and children's right to recreation. And what they've decided is to focus on 6 particular groups of children. And the groups of children, in no particular order, really have been identified through looking globally. And you might say, well, in fact, this doesn't affect us in Dublin. But hopefully I'll convince you that we do need to change. We've spoken about population, but we haven't spoken about the disaggregated data, which I was completely relying on Frances to do, because I thought, yes, all right, that's grand, she'll cover that one. But looking at disaggregated data and who are affected by these decisions in inner city. So largely, I suppose part of the problem has been that states generally do not see themselves as having a direct effect on the lives of children and families, and certainly in relation to play, that's always been the case. So there's traditionally been a lack of investment in terms of appropriate provision. There's been weak or non-existent legislative provision. And then there's also been complete invisibility, while it's improving in Ireland, but the invisibility of children, either in national or local planning. So the 6 groups of children that the UN Committee have asked us to particularly focus on. The first group is girls. That might surprise you, but girls generally have lower participation rates in physical activity and organised games, and as a consequence enter sometimes because of cultural reasons or self-imposed exclusions or lack of appropriate provision. The second group, and this is the group that is very affected, certainly in Dublin, is children living in poverty. And I was looking at Francis's photographs. I walk home through Dublin 1, through Summerhill and Ballybock. I'd have a completely different set of photographs, and I must do it because it's a very powerful way of communicating what you see in the inner city. But in terms of children in poverty, there's lack of access to facilities, an inability to afford the costs of participation. Recently we've heard about children in direct provision, children who have not any money to engage or participate in any play or recreation activities and become part of our communities. So it serves to further compound the exclusion of children like that. The committee nominate the importance of parks and playgrounds for children living in poverty in particular. And for many children, the risks to their safety and health is compounded by home environments which provide no or little space at all, and which is why they rely sometimes entirely on the opportunity for public space. The third group of children is children with disabilities, and that may be no surprise. This isn't simply about physical accessibility of space, but about the integration of children with disabilities. It's about equal access between children to play and recreation, and really about the introduction of proactive measures that are needed to remove the barriers and promote accessibility to and the availability of inclusive opportunities for children with disabilities. The fourth group is children in institutions, and you might say we don't have institutions in inner city Dublin. We certainly do. Many children while it's a small number of children, and yes, I'm talking about children on the margins, we do have children. We've over 6,000 children in care of the state, and some of these children spend very significant parts of their childhood in institutions. Are there institutions in our city? Yes, there are institutions in our city. We have children living in residential care homes. We have children in schools. They are institutions. I know certainly in Francis Street, if any of you have been to the school in Francis Street, there is very little room for those boys to play and to enjoy their school day. Most of it is spent inside in buildings. There are hospitals. We're having big discussions about the new children's hospital and the need for play. People assume that if you're a sick child you don't need to play, but in fact it can be very therapeutic in that context. We've refugee centres, we've direct provision, where opportunities for play are either limited or they're non-existent. The fifth group then is children from Indigenous and minority communities. And this is, again, it is an inner city problem. The demographics of children here, and you referred to the Lewis, if we tracked along that Lewis line, you would find that the demographic has changed quite entirely in the inner city. Ethnic, religious, racial discrimination can serve to exclude children. And there's a huge underreporting in Ireland. We haven't yet got the data or the evidence to support the change in policy, to sometimes support our changes in law, but it's certainly known that there are huge underreporting of these kind of actions towards children that serve to exclude them. And there's much higher incidence for children from minority communities, from Indigenous communities, of their interaction with the Gardaí, with the police, being picked up on the street or being stopped and searched, or just stopped and questioned because they're hanging around the streets and they have nothing to do. And the sixth group, which you might think don't really relate to our inner city, and again is the smaller population, relate to children who've lived in situations of conflict or children who have been subject to humanitarian or natural disasters. Yes, again, a small population, but we worked with migrant children, 220 migrant children who had come from other countries, living here without their parents or legal guardian, who had been through very traumatic experiences. Some of those children had seen their parents be sexually assaulted, had seen their parents even murdered, but were living in really quite destitute conditions before they came to Ireland. And it's very well internationally recognised that play and recreation and integrating in public spaces allows these children to not only integrate, but to develop a sense of self-belief, to readjust their normality of life, having come from areas of conflict and such poverty. Things like play, music, poetry or drama can help refugee and children in particular who've experienced bereavement, violence, abuse and exploitation to overcome that emotional pain. Now, I'm not placing all that burden on yourselves, I'm just explaining that there are groups of children, and we have a very high population in Ireland. Almost 25% of our population are children. So while there is a moral imperative, let me look to and just introduce you to also the legal imperative. In terms of international human rights law, and very specifically in relation to children, there are three key principles that need to be considered. The first is best interests. So as a public body, as an institution who have a huge responsibility for the decisions that are made and often have a profound effect. I'm not sure if you were listening to Morning Ireland this morning, but a father of a child with very severe autism was interviewed about his experience of not getting a service from the health service. And what came across very strongly was the gap between the person who needed the service and the lack of interaction between the people who were making the decision. And the point the child's father made was, he said, this is a desktop exercise. No one spoke to my family. There was absolutely no interaction in terms of that decision. So we make decisions that very often can very profoundly affect children and families, but we don't always connect or we don't always consult with them to try and understand their needs as a community. The second is non-discrimination, a very fundamental principle of both equality and human rights, that we shouldn't discriminate against any group. And the third is about participation. It's about consulting. It's about engaging directly with the communities that you serve to see what their needs are. So in addition to that international human rights law, the piece that Kieran referred to that's now part of our own law here since the 1st of November is what's called a positive duty. Traditionally, human rights are articulated in terms of what's described as a negative obligation on the state. So the state's duty to not interfere, or the state's duty to not cause any harm. In this case, it's a duty that's expressed and articulated in a positive way to try and encourage people to proactively consider whether they're developing corporate plans, whether it's your development plan, whether it's your policy. That law translates to policy, that translates into the very real experience of children and families. So we're expected to consider now and have regard to three key things. The first, positive duty that is now on all public bodies in Ireland. The first is about eliminating discrimination. So you're expected to have regard to these principles. The second is about the promotion of equality of opportunity, not equality of treatment, equality of opportunity. And the third is about human rights. And it's not just about the staff or the members of your organisation, but it's also about the experience of people to whom you provide a service. So we are going to have regard to the public. So this public duty can relate to looking at, I suppose, how it resonates for Dublin City Council, issues of social housing, regeneration, parks and playgrounds, libraries, community facilities. I spent a good bit of time as Ombudsman for Children out and about in communities and was very impressed by a number of local authorities and a number of individuals that I met who were very committed, but perhaps see themselves as powerless in these very large systems that don't oblige them to consider some of the principles that I'm talking about. I was very struck in particular, I don't see Brendan Kenny here, but I was very struck in particular in Limerick and South Hill, places like the Island in Limerick, places like Knocknaheeny in Cork, where you meet people who are at community level who are extraordinarily committed, but they're working in very powerless systems where maybe even the staff themselves aren't consulted or asked about their expertise in developing policy. So I know that Dublin City Council has been involved, I know this is Ombudsman for Children, in many initiatives that have involved I suppose, innovation around children and families. You mentioned women and the Safer Cities project, and that's very good. The purpose of the positive duty is to try and embed in our thinking, to try and systematically get us to think about human rights and equality when we're making decisions. So it's not just about setting up a project, an ephemeral project that begins and ends. It's about systematically thinking, whether you're writing your development plan, your corporate plan or your strategy or policy, that this is something that we will have regard to over a long period of time. I think I'll end it there and just leave you with those initial thoughts. Thank you.